Before we walked into church that Sunday morning, my son pulled me away from the front steps and into the shade of an old maple tree. His voice was so low I almost thought I had imagined it. "Mom," he whispered, without looking me in the eyes, "don't come back. It's over." For a second, the world seemed to stop. The church bells continued, ringing across Franklin, Tennessee. Families smiled as they greeted one another. Someone held the door open for us, but all I could hear were those 4 words echoing inside my chest. "Don't come back." I searched Ethan's face for some sign that this was a misunderstanding, some nervous joke that had gone too far. Instead, he simply straightened his jacket, forced a poignant smile, and walked toward the sanctuary as if he had said nothing at all. I stood there with my hand wrapped around my purse, feeling the cool morning breeze against my face, wondering how a son could sound so calm while quietly breaking his mother's heart. Before I tell you what happened after that, may I ask you for one small favor? If this story truly resonates with you, let me know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. Reading your messages reminds me that even strangers can sometimes offer the kindness family forgets to give. My name is Margaret Collins. I am 71 years old, and what happened that Sunday changed forever the way I understood love, loyalty, and the meaning of home. Until then, I believed that no matter how complicated life became, my family would always leave a place for me at the table. I had no idea that before sunset, I would be standing outside my own front door wondering whether I still belonged anywhere at all. As the choir began singing, I slipped quietly into my usual pew near the middle of the sanctuary. Pastor Michael's voice filled the room with familiar warmth, but my thoughts drifted back to Ethan's whisper. I tried to focus on the sermon. I bowed my head during prayer. I even sang the hymns I had known for decades. Yet every few minutes, I caught myself glancing across the aisle where Ethan sat beside his wife, Vanessa. She never looked in my direction. Instead, she leaned close to him once or twice, saying something that made him nod, almost imperceptibly. My stomach tightened. During the final hymn, an elderly friend named Carol gently touched my arm. "Margaret," she smiled. "Are you joining us for coffee afterward?" I forced a smile of my own. "Not today. I think I should head home." "Everything all right?" she asked softly. I hesitated just long enough to make her notice. "I'm sure it will be." I wanted to believe those words. Looking back now, I realized they were more hope than certainty. Outside, the bright Tennessee sun had already warmed the church parking lot. Ethan approached me just long enough to say, "Drive safely, Mom." Nothing more. No hug. No explanation. Vanessa remained by the passenger door, her sunglasses hiding her eyes. But I noticed the faint smile at the corner of her mouth before she climbed into their SUV. As they drove away, I stood alone beside my car with an uneasiness I couldn't explain. Something inside me whispered that the conversation under the maple tree had not been the beginning of the story. It was the end of something they believed they had already finished. What neither of them knew was that there was one promise my late husband had made years earlier, a promise I had almost forgotten myself. And before that afternoon was over, that forgotten promise would become the first crack in a secret neither Ethan nor Vanessa had ever imagined. I drove away from the church parking lot more slowly than usual, keeping both hands on the steering wheel as though holding on to something that was quietly slipping away. The roads through Franklin looked exactly as they always had on a Sunday. Families walked toward small restaurants after the service. Children laughed as they chased one another across the town square. Nothing around me suggested that my own life had shifted beneath my feet less than an hour earlier. I kept hearing Ethan's voice in my mind. It was not loud. It was not angry. Somehow, that made it hurt even more. My son had always spoken softly. Even as a little boy, he rarely raised his voice. I remembered kneeling beside his bed when he was 8 years old, after he had fallen off his bicycle. "Does it hurt, sweetheart?" I had asked while cleaning the scrape on his knee. He looked at me with watery eyes and whispered, "Only a little, Mom." Back then, I believed I could protect him from every pain life might bring. I never imagined that decades later, the deepest wound I would carry would come from that same quiet voice. After my husband Robert passed away 4 years earlier, people often asked whether I planned to move closer to Ethan. "You should not live alone," my neighbor Susan would tell me whenever we watered our flower beds together. I always smiled. I am not alone. I have memories, good neighbors, and a son who visits when he can. At least, that was what I believed. Robert and I had spent more than 40 years building our life together. He worked as a civil engineer, and I spent nearly 3 decades as an administrative assistant at the county courthouse. We were never wealthy, but every paycheck had a purpose. Every improvement to our little brick house came one careful decision at a time. We planted the maple tree in the front yard when Ethan graduated from high school. Robert built the back porch with his own hands one summer, insisting every board had to be perfectly level. "This house should outlive both of us," he used to say with a proud grin. Every room held a memory that money could never replace. After he died, I kept his routines alive because they made the silence easier to bear. Every Saturday morning, I trimmed the roses he loved. Every Sunday, I attended church before coming home to read with a cup of coffee on the porch. It was never about the house itself. It was about the life that still seemed to breathe inside its walls. Ethan and Vanessa had moved in almost 2 years earlier after selling their condominium. "Just until we find something bigger," Ethan had promised while carrying boxes through the front door. I kissed his cheek and answered without hesitation, "Take all the time you need. Family helps family." At first, everything felt natural. Vanessa thanked me for dinner. Ethan helped mow the lawn. We laughed together over old family photographs. But little things began to change so gradually that I almost convinced myself I was imagining them. One evening, I reached for my favorite chair in the living room, and Vanessa smiled politely before saying, "Would you mind using the recliner instead? This one fits our decorating better." I laughed awkwardly. "Of course." Another afternoon, she opened my kitchen cabinets and rearranged every shelf without asking. "It is simply more efficient this way," she explained. Ethan barely looked up from his phone. "She is only trying to help, Mom." I told myself those were small adjustments that families make when they share a home. I chose peace over pride every single time. Yet as I turned onto my street that Sunday afternoon, an uncomfortable realization settled over me. Ethan's whisper outside the church had not appeared out of nowhere. It belonged to a pattern that had been quietly growing for much longer than I had been willing to admit, and for the first time, I found myself wondering what else had been happening right in front of me while I kept choosing to look away. The closer I came to my street, the heavier my foot felt on the brake pedal. It was not fear exactly. It was the strange feeling that pieces of a puzzle I had ignored for months were quietly fitting together on their own. Looking back now, I realized that Sunday did not begin the story. It only exposed what had been growing inside my own home for a very long time. Vanessa had never been openly cruel. That was what made everything so confusing. She wrapped every demand in a pleasant smile, every insult inside a sentence that sounded almost reasonable. "Margaret," she would say while setting grocery bags on the kitchen counter, "you are home all day anyway. Would you mind putting everything away?" Of course I did. A few weeks later it became, "Would you mind making dinner? Ethan has had such a stressful day." Then it turned into, "Could you stay home tonight? We already told our friends we could use your parking space." None of those requests sounded terrible by themselves. The problem was that they slowly became expectations instead of favors. One evening, I was folding my own laundry when Vanessa walked past carrying 2 baskets. She smiled without stopping. Would you mind doing ours too? You always fold everything so much better than I do. Before I could answer, she was already walking upstairs. I stood there holding one of Robert's old flannel shirts, wondering why saying no suddenly felt impossible inside my own house. Ethan rarely noticed. Or perhaps he chose not to. Whenever I mentioned something that made me uncomfortable, he would sigh softly and rub the back of his neck the way he always did when he wanted to avoid conflict. "Mom," he said one evening while we cleared the dinner table together, "Vanessa is still adjusting. She is trying to make the place feel like home." I looked around the kitchen Robert and I had planned together more than 20 years earlier. "It already was a home," I answered quietly. Ethan smiled, but it never reached his eyes. "You know what I mean." I did know what he meant, and that was exactly what troubled me. Little by little, I noticed my own routines disappearing. The family photographs Robert loved were replaced with oversized framed prints Vanessa ordered online. My reading lamp vanished from the living room because it did not match the new furniture. Even the flower pots on the front porch were rearranged while I was visiting a friend. "It looks cleaner this way," Vanessa explained cheerfully. "I hope you do not mind." I minded more than I admitted. Still, I simply nodded. My neighbor Susan noticed before I did. One afternoon she leaned across the fence while I watered what remained of my roses. "Margaret," she asked carefully, "are you happy with all these changes?" I hesitated long enough for her to understand the answer. "Families have to compromise," I finally said. Susan frowned. "Compromise usually goes both ways." Her words stayed with me for days. Then came the first moment that truly unsettled me. I reached for the spare house key that had always rested inside the small blue ceramic bowl near the hallway table. It was gone. I searched every drawer I could think of before asking Vanessa if she had seen it. "Oh," she replied casually while scrolling through her phone, "I moved it somewhere safer. Too many people know where spare keys are kept." "Where is it now?" I asked. She smiled. "Do not worry. If you ever need it, just ask me." Something about that answer made the room feel smaller. Later that evening, I quietly mentioned it to Ethan. He barely glanced up from his laptop. "She is only being careful, Mom. It is not a big deal." Maybe it was not. At least, that was what I kept telling myself. But as I parked my car in front of the house that Sunday afternoon, my eyes immediately drifted toward the front door. From where I sat behind the steering wheel, I noticed something I had never seen before. The brass lock Robert had installed with his own hands was gone, replaced by a brand new one that reflected the afternoon sun like polished gold. My heartbeat slowed instead of quickened, as though some quiet part of me had already known this moment was coming. For a long moment, I remained in the driver's seat, staring at the unfamiliar lock. The house itself looked exactly the same. The white shutters Robert had painted. Every other spring still framed the windows. The wind chime hanging from the porch roof swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, playing the same soft melody I had heard for years. From the outside, nothing had changed. But somehow, I already knew I was no longer being welcomed home. I stepped onto the porch and slipped my key into the new lock. It stopped halfway. I pulled it out, turned it over in my hand, and tried again. Nothing. The metal scraped uselessly against a lock it no longer belonged to. I knocked once, softly at first. Then again, a little louder. I heard footsteps inside. The curtains in the front window shifted. A second later, Vanessa appeared behind the glass. She looked directly at me without opening the door. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then she folded her arms and smiled. It was the same practiced smile she used whenever she wanted to sound pleasant, while making someone feel small. She unlocked the inner deadbolt, but left the storm door closed between us. "Margaret," she said calmly, "I thought you understood what Ethan told you this morning." I looked at her through the glass. I came home. No, she replied, shaking her head almost sympathetically. You came back. There was a difference in the way she emphasized those words that made my stomach tighten. My key does not work, I said quietly. We changed the locks, she answered. It was necessary. Necessary for whom? Her smile never faded. For everyone who lives here. The words settled heavily between us. Everyone who lives here. I glanced past her shoulder into the hallway. The small oak table Robert had built was gone. The framed photograph from our 40th wedding anniversary no longer hung beside the staircase. Even from where I stood, something felt strangely empty inside the house. Where are my things? I asked. Vanessa hesitated for only a heartbeat. They have been packed. My voice remained steady, although I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. Packed where? That is something you should discuss with Ethan. As if on cue, I heard his footsteps coming down the hallway. He stopped several feet behind his wife, keeping his distance as though the glass door had become a wall much thicker than it appeared. He would not meet my eyes. Mom, he said softly, please do not make this harder than it has to be. I searched his face for the little boy who once ran into my arms after school, but all I found was a man avoiding the consequences of his own choices. Harder for whom? I asked. Silence filled the porch. Finally, Ethan spoke again. Vanessa and I have decided it is time for you to move somewhere that better fits your stage of life. I almost smiled, not because the words were kind, but because they sounded rehearsed, as though they had been practiced long before this afternoon. You decided? I asked. Vanessa answered before he could. This house needs a fresh start. I looked through the doorway once more. Cardboard boxes lined the hallway. My favorite reading chair was gone. The blue quilt my sister had sewn for me was nowhere to be seen. Yet what unsettled me most was not what had disappeared, it was what remained. On the small table beside the staircase sat Robert's old leather Bible, exactly where he had left it before he died. Neither of them knew why he had insisted that book should never be moved. Vanessa noticed my eyes settle on it and quietly stepped sideways, blocking my view. There is nothing here for you anymore, she said. I lowered my gaze, nodded once, and turned toward my car without another word. Behind me, I heard the lock click into place. But just as I reached the end of the walkway, my phone vibrated. The screen displayed a message from an unfamiliar number containing only one sentence. Mrs. Collins, this is Daniel Harper. We need to speak today about something your husband left unfinished. I stood beside my car for several seconds, reading the message again and again until the words blurred together. I did not recognize the number, but I recognized the name. Daniel Harper had handled several property transactions for families in Williamson County over the years. Robert had mentioned him once or twice, though never in detail. I slipped my phone into my purse without replying. The front door behind me remained closed. The house was only 20 feet away, yet it suddenly felt farther than any place I had ever traveled. Before starting the engine, I looked through the windshield one last time. The curtains moved slightly. Someone was watching. I did not wave. I simply drove away. I stopped at a small coffee shop a few miles from home, one Robert and I used to visit after grocery shopping on Saturday mornings. The young woman behind the counter smiled warmly. Good afternoon. The usual? I realized she still remembered my order after all these years. Yes, I answered softly. Just black coffee. I carried the cup to a table near the window, my hands wrapped around the warmth more for comfort than for the coffee itself. A few minutes later, my phone rang. Ethan's name appeared on the screen. I answered after the second ring. Mom. His voice sounded careful, almost rehearsed. I hope you found somewhere to stay tonight. I closed my eyes for a moment. You changed the locks while I was at church. Silence. Then he sighed. We did not want a scene, so you chose surprise instead? Another pause followed. Vanessa and I believe this is best for everyone. I looked out the window as an elderly couple walked hand in hand across the parking lot. Did you ever ask what was best for me? He did not answer. Instead, he quietly said, "Please do not make this complicated." The line went silent a moment later. He had ended the call without saying goodbye. I sat there for a long time before driving to Susan's house. She opened the door before I reached the porch, as though she had sensed something was wrong. One look at my face was enough. "Margaret," she whispered, pulling me into a gentle hug. "Come inside." We sat at her kitchen table while she poured sweet tea into 2 glasses. I told her only the facts. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. When I finished, Susan stared at the table for several seconds before speaking. "You know this is not normal." I nodded slowly. "I know. Where are your clothes?" "I do not know." "Your photographs?" I shook my head. "I do not know." She reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. "Then you are staying here tonight." Before I could thank her, her phone buzzed with a neighborhood message. Her expression changed almost immediately. "Margaret," she said carefully, "people are already talking." She turned the screen toward me. Someone had posted that I had voluntarily moved out because I could no longer manage living alone. Another comment praised Ethan and Vanessa for helping his mother transition into a safer place. I read every word without speaking. It was not only my home that had been taken from me. Someone had already begun rewriting the story before I had spoken a single sentence. Susan looked at me with tears in her eyes. Who would say something like this? I quietly locked my phone and slipped it back into my purse. Someone who needs everyone else to believe they did the right thing. Late that afternoon, I finally returned the message from Daniel Harper. He answered immediately. "Mrs. Collins," he said, "thank you for calling." His voice was calm, almost unusually calm. "Can you meet me at my office before 5? "Is this really important?" I asked. There was a brief silence before he replied. "Your husband asked me years ago to contact you only if something very specific ever happened." I felt my heart slow instead of race. "What happened today," he continued quietly, "is exactly what he described." Daniel Harper's office occupied the 2nd floor of a quiet red brick building just off Main Street in downtown Franklin. By the time I parked across the street, the afternoon sun had begun to soften, stretching long shadows across the sidewalks. My reflection in the car window looked older than it had that morning. Not because of the lines on my face, those had been there for years. It was my eyes. They carried the weight of a woman who had spent an entire day discovering that grief could arrive long after a funeral. I climbed the stairs slowly, one hand resting on the polished oak railing. Daniel himself opened the office door before I had a chance to knock. He looked to be in his early 50s, dressed simply in a navy suit, with his tie already loosened after what had probably been a long day. He extended his hand warmly. "Mrs. Collins, thank you for coming. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice." His receptionist quietly offered me a glass of water before leaving us alone in a conference room overlooking the courthouse square where I had worked for nearly 30 years. Seeing that familiar building filled me with memories of younger days when I believed honesty was always enough to protect a person. Daniel noticed me looking out the window. "You spent many years over there, did you not?" I smiled faintly. "Almost 3 decades. Robert spoke about that often." Hearing my husband's name spoken so naturally caught me off guard. Daniel sat down but did not open the thick file resting beside him. Instead, he folded his hands. "Before we discuss anything else, I need to ask you one question." I nodded. "Did your son and daughter-in-law ask you to leave voluntarily?" "No." "Did you give them permission to replace the locks?" "No." He simply nodded once and wrote 2 short notes on a yellow legal pad. There was no anger on his face, only quiet concentration. "Mrs. Collins," he said gently, "I know today has been painful. I also know your first instinct is probably to preserve your relationship with your son. I lowered my eyes. He is still my son. Daniel leaned back in his chair. That answer tells me Robert understood you very well. He did not explain what he meant. Instead, he slid the unopened file a few inches closer before resting his hand on top of it without lifting the cover. Everything inside this folder has been waiting for the right moment. My heart skipped, but I made no move toward it. Somehow I already sensed that opening it would change far more than my living situation. It would change the way I understood the last years of my husband's life. My phone vibrated again. This time it was a voicemail notification from Ethan. I excused myself and stepped into the hallway to listen. His voice sounded strained. "Mom, people are asking questions. Please stop talking to neighbors. Vanessa is upset. We are trying to handle this privately." I listened to the message twice. Not once did he ask where I was sleeping. Not once did he ask whether I was safe. When I returned to the conference room, Daniel looked up quietly. "Would you like to hear it?" he asked. I slipped my phone back into my purse and slowly shook my head. No. For the first time all day, I heard my own voice without hesitation. I think I have listened enough. A peaceful silence settled between us. Outside, the courthouse clock struck 5. Daniel gave a small, understanding nod. "Then perhaps," he said softly, "it is finally time for you to start listening to Robert instead." I looked at the unopened file resting between us. For hours I had been reacting to everyone else's decisions. Ethan's whisper, Vanessa's smile, the changed locks, the rumors, the phone calls. Sitting there, something inside me quietly shifted. I realized I no longer needed to convince anyone that I belonged in my own life. I only needed the courage to learn what my husband had tried so carefully to protect. I took a slow breath, placed both hands on the conference table, and looked directly at Daniel. "Tomorrow," I said calmly, "I will do whatever needs to be done. But tonight, I want to know why Robert believed this day would come." Daniel rested his fingers on the corner of the file, met my eyes, and answered with only 4 words. "Then we should begin." Daniel did not rush to open the file. Instead, he stood and walked toward a tall cabinet beside the window. From one of the shelves, he removed a small wooden box with brass corners that looked as though it had been carefully stored for years. He placed it on the conference table between us, but left the lid closed. "Robert believed timing mattered," he said quietly. "He never wanted important decisions to be made in anger." I ran my fingers across the smooth wood without lifting the lid. It reminded me of the cedar chest my husband had built for our first Christmas together. He always believed that some things deserved patience. Daniel watched me for a moment before speaking again. "Mrs. Collins, I am going to ask you to trust the process for a little while longer." I nodded. "I have waited this long. I can wait a little longer." He gave me a faint smile. "Good." Instead of explaining everything, he handed me a legal pad. "Tonight I need you to write down every detail you remember from today. Every conversation, every message, every time, even the smallest thing." "Will it matter?" I asked. Sometimes the smallest detail becomes the strongest truth. I spent the next half hour quietly reconstructing the day. The whisper beneath the maple tree, the changed lock, Vanessa's words through the glass, Ethan's phone call, the neighborhood rumors. Daniel never interrupted me. Occasionally he asked simple questions. What exact words did she use? Who was standing closest to the door? Did anyone else witness the conversation? His questions were calm, never dramatic, yet each answer seemed to settle into place like another piece of something much larger. When I finished, he carefully slid my handwritten notes into a folder. "Keep your phone," he said. "Do not delete messages. Do not respond emotionally. If they contact you, answer politely or not at all. Silence often preserves the truth better than arguments." I looked at him curiously. You expected me to fight? He shook his head. No, I expected you to protect your dignity. Those are very different things. As evening settled over Franklin, I drove back to Susan's house. She was sitting on the front porch waiting for me with 2 bowls of homemade vegetable soup. I kept dinner warm, she said softly. We ate in comfortable silence until she finally asked, "Did you find help?" I smiled for what felt like the first genuine time that day. I found someone who listened. Susan reached across the table and gently squeezed my hand. Sometimes that is where healing begins. My phone buzzed again before I could answer. This time it was a text from Vanessa. Your remaining things will be dropped off later this week. Please do not come back to the house. We need space to move forward. I read the message once, then quietly locked the screen. Susan studied my face. Bad news? No, I answered after a thoughtful pause. Just confirmation. For the first time since leaving church that morning, I realized I no longer felt desperate. Sad, yes. Heartbroken, certainly. But not desperate. Their confidence had become so complete that they no longer questioned their own actions. They believed the story had already ended. They believed I had nowhere left to stand. Before going upstairs to the guest room, I called Daniel one final time. I have done exactly as you asked. I said, Good, he replied. Tomorrow morning, do not go anywhere until you hear from me. Should I expect something? There was a brief pause before he answered. I expect someone else will make the next move. We simply need to be ready when they do. After we hung up, I stood by the bedroom window looking toward the quiet street below. The town had settled into peaceful darkness, but I could not shake the feeling that somewhere across Franklin, another conversation was taking place, one I had not been invited to hear. And somehow, I knew that whatever Ethan and Vanessa were planning for the next morning would become the very thing they wished they had never done. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Robert's Bible resting on the small table inside the house and wondered why, out of everything that had been removed, that single object had remained untouched. Before sunrise, I was already awake, sitting at Susan's kitchen table with a mug of coffee growing cold between my hands. The neighborhood was quiet except for the distant sound of lawn sprinklers and the occasional delivery truck rolling down the street. At exactly 8 o'clock, my phone rang. Mrs. Collins, Daniel said. Thank you for waiting. I need you to come to my office again this morning. Bring your driver's license and anything that still belongs to Robert if you have it. I looked at the wedding band I still wore on my left hand. I have never stopped carrying him with me. Daniel's voice softened. That may matter more than you realize. During the drive into downtown Franklin, I noticed how ordinary everything appeared. People hurried into coffee shops. Store owners unlocked their doors. Life continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened. It reminded me that the hardest battles are often completely invisible to everyone except the people living through them. Daniel was already waiting when I arrived. This time, the wooden box was gone. In its place lay several sealed envelopes and a stack of neatly organized folders secured with colored tabs. He motioned for me to sit without saying a word. There are a few things we need to verify first, he explained. One by one, he asked me to confirm dates, signatures, addresses, and small details from the past several years. Did Robert ever ask you not to remove certain documents from the house? Yes, I answered after thinking carefully. He always said one drawer in his study should remain exactly as it was. Daniel made another note. Did anyone besides you and Robert know that? Not that I am aware of. He nodded, almost as though that answer had confirmed something he had quietly suspected. A few minutes later, another woman entered the conference room carrying a thin file box. Daniel introduced her simply as Linda Brooks, a licensed notary who had known Robert professionally for many years. She smiled kindly before placing the box on the table. "Your husband was a very careful man," she said. "He believed that if important things were done properly, they would never have to be defended with anger." I felt tears gathering but blinked them away. Daniel slid one sealed envelope toward me, then gently placed his hand on top of it before I could reach for it. "Not yet," he said. "There is one more step." My phone vibrated across the table. Ethan's name flashed on the screen again. Daniel glanced at it but said nothing. I answered on speaker. "Mom," Ethan began, sounding impatient this time. "We need you to sign a few papers this afternoon. It will make everything easier." I looked at Daniel. He remained completely still. "What papers?" I asked. "Just routine paperwork. Vanessa already spoke with someone about it. Can you send them to me first?" There was a brief pause. "It is easier if you come in person." His words no longer sounded like a request. They sounded like someone trying to stay ahead of something he did not fully understand. "I will let you know," I replied calmly before ending the call. Daniel slowly leaned back in his chair. "That happened sooner than I expected." "What does it mean?" I asked. "It means," he answered carefully, "someone is in a hurry." He finally removed his hand from the sealed envelope, but still did not ask me to open it. Instead, he handed me another folder containing copies of public records and several pages marked with yellow notes. "Read these tonight," he said. "Do not show them to anyone. Tomorrow morning, we will take the next step together." As I gathered the papers into my purse, a courier knocked on the conference room door and handed Daniel a certified envelope that had arrived only moments earlier. He examined the return address, his expression changing almost imperceptibly. Without opening it, he looked directly at me and quietly said, "Mrs. Collins, I believe your son has already made a decision that he cannot take back." I did not open the folder until late that evening. Susan had gone upstairs, leaving a small lamp glowing in the living room and a slice of apple pie covered with a clean kitchen towel on the counter. The house was quiet in the comforting way only an old home can be. I spread the papers across the dining room table, one page at a time, careful not to rush. Robert always believed that important things deserved patience. As I read, I realized Daniel had not given me answers. He had given me a trail to follow. There were copies of property records, dated years apart. There were notarized signatures I recognized immediately. Robert's handwriting appeared in the margins of several documents, neat and deliberate, exactly as I remembered from the notes he used to leave beside the coffee maker. None of it explained everything, but it changed one thing I had believed since Sunday morning. Ethan and Vanessa had not acted on impulse. Whatever they had done had been planned carefully enough that they believed paperwork alone would make it permanent. The thought hurt more than I expected. I reached for Robert's old reading glasses, the pair I still kept in my purse after all these years. I did not need them to read. I simply needed to feel that a small part of him was still beside me. My phone buzzed again. This time it was not Ethan. It was a voicemail from our pastor. "Margaret, I wanted to check on you. Ethan mentioned you were taking some time away from the house. If there is anything the church can do, please call me." I listened quietly before placing the phone face down on the table. Ethan had already begun telling a version of the story. Not the truth. A version. I felt sadness, but strangely, I no longer felt surprised. The next morning, I returned to Daniel's office carrying the folder exactly as he had instructed. He noticed immediately that every page remained in the same careful order. "You read everything," he observed. "Twice," I answered. He smiled faintly. Robert would have appreciated that. He opened one of the sealed envelopes for the first time, and removed a single folded sheet. He did not hand it to me. Instead, he read one paragraph aloud. "If Margaret is sitting in this office because she has been pressured to leave the house against her will, then events have unfolded exactly as I feared." My breath caught. Daniel lowered the paper before continuing. "This letter was signed by your husband nearly 3 years before he passed away, and left in my care under very specific instructions. I stared at him, unable to speak. Robert did not predict the future, Daniel said gently. He simply recognized patterns. My mind drifted back to evenings when Robert quietly watched conversations at the dinner table without interrupting. More than once I had asked, "What are you thinking?" He always smiled and answered, "Nothing worth worrying about tonight." I believed him every time. Now I wondered how much he had chosen to carry alone. "Why did he never tell me?" I whispered. Daniel answered without hesitation, "Because he hoped he would never need to." The room fell silent. Outside, a courthouse bell marked the hour. Daniel finally slid the letter across the table, but before I unfolded it, he placed another document beside it. "There is something else you need to understand first," he said. "This letter explains why Robert contacted me. This document explains what he did next." I looked from one paper to the other. The first had my husband's unmistakable signature. The second carried an official county seal I had seen thousands of times during my years at the courthouse. Whatever it contained had been recorded long before anyone changed the locks on my front door. Daniel rested his hand lightly on the sealed document and met my eyes. "Once you read this," he said quietly, "you will understand why your son asked you to sign papers yesterday, but you will also understand why he was already too late." My hands rested on the edge of the conference table as I looked at the county seal impressed into the document before me. I had spent nearly 30 years filing deeds, notarizing records, and watching families buy, sell, and inherit property. I knew exactly what an official recording looked like. What I did not understand was why Robert had completed it without ever telling me. Daniel waited until I looked up before speaking. "Mrs. Collins, before I explain anything, I want you to remember something your husband told me many years ago." He unfolded another sheet of paper and quietly read aloud. "If my wife is reading this, she will probably blame herself first. Please remind her that love is never a mistake. Trust is never a mistake. Only the people who choose to abuse them are responsible." I closed my eyes for a moment. That sounded exactly like Robert. Even now he was trying to protect my heart before protecting anything else. Daniel carefully turned the recorded document toward me. 3 years before his death, Robert transferred the property into a protected estate arrangement. The home was never left vulnerable to private transfer, unauthorized occupancy, or informal agreements. Legally, no one could remove you from the property without following the law. Not your son, not anyone. I stared at the signatures, Robert's, the county recorder's, the official filing date. Everything had been completed years before the morning Ethan asked me not to come home. Suddenly, dozens of moments that had confused me began falling into place. Robert insisting that one drawer in his study remain untouched. His repeated reminder that the Bible should stay exactly where it was. His quiet conversations with Daniel that I had never questioned. He had not been hiding secrets from me. He had been quietly building protection around me in case love inside our family was ever replaced by entitlement. "Then why did Ethan ask me to sign papers yesterday?" I whispered. Daniel folded his hands. "Because he believed your signature would simplify something he assumed had already happened. He did not know this filing existed." I felt no triumph, only a deep sadness. Somewhere along the way, my son had become so certain he was entitled to my home that he never stopped to ask whether the law saw things differently. Daniel opened Robert's letter completely and handed it to me at last. My husband's familiar handwriting filled the page. There was no anger in his words, no accusations, only calm foresight. He wrote that families sometimes change in ways no one expects, that kindness should never require surrendering one's dignity, that protecting someone you love sometimes means preparing for a day you pray never comes. By the time I reached the final sentence, tears blurred the ink. "If this letter has reached you," Robert wrote, Remember that your home was never only brick and wood. It is the place where your dignity lives. Defend that dignity with truth, never with revenge. I quietly folded the letter and placed it back inside its envelope. Daniel gave me time before speaking again. "There is one final step," he said. "This afternoon we will deliver formal notice through the proper legal process. No arguments, no raised voices, only the facts." I nodded. "I do not want to embarrass Ethan." "I know," Daniel replied. "That is why we will let the documents speak instead of emotions." We left the office together just after noon. The summer air felt warmer than it had only a few days earlier, yet something inside me felt lighter. For the first time since standing beneath that maple tree outside the church, I understood why Robert had remained so calm during the final years of his life. He had trusted that truth, properly preserved, would eventually protect me when he no longer could. As Daniel placed the sealed legal envelope into his briefcase, he paused beside his car and looked toward me with quiet certainty. "By this evening," he said, "the balance will begin to change. But Mrs. Collins, what happens after they read these documents may be far more difficult than anything that has happened so far." The formal notice was delivered that same afternoon. Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not threaten anyone. He simply handed the sealed documents to Ethan and Vanessa at the front door while a licensed process server stood quietly beside him. I remained several steps back near the sidewalk, not because I was afraid, but because this was never meant to become a confrontation. The truth did not need my help to be heard. Ethan opened the envelope with hands that looked steadier than I suspected he felt. His eyes moved quickly across the first page. Then they slowed, his shoulders stiffened. He read the next page again before looking toward Daniel. "This cannot be right," he said, though there was far less confidence in his voice than there had been only 2 days earlier. Daniel answered calmly. "These documents were properly recorded years ago. You are welcome to verify every page with the county recorder." Vanessa stepped closer and reached for the papers. "There has to be some mistake." Daniel simply shook his head. "The law has already answered that question." For the first time since Sunday morning, neither of them had another argument ready. They looked at one another as though waiting for the other person to explain what had happened. But there was nothing left to explain. The facts had quietly arrived, and they spoke far more clearly than anger ever could. News travels quickly through a neighborhood, especially one where people have known each other for years. By the following morning, the rumors had begun changing. The same neighbors who had believed I had willingly moved away were now learning that the situation had been far more complicated. No one celebrated. No one mocked Ethan or Vanessa. Most people simply became quieter. Susan visited me that afternoon carrying fresh blueberry muffins. She placed the basket on the kitchen counter and sat beside me without saying anything for several moments. Finally, she smiled gently. "People understand now." I looked down at my coffee cup. "That was never my goal." "I know," she replied. "That is why they believe you." Late that evening, my phone rang again. This time, Ethan did not hesitate when I answered. His voice sounded different, tired, smaller somehow. "Mom," he began before stopping altogether. Several long seconds passed between us. "I should have talked to you," he finally whispered. I closed my eyes. Those words carried more honesty than anything he had said in days. "Yes," I answered quietly. "You should have." He drew a slow breath. "I kept telling myself we were only speeding things up. Vanessa said you would understand eventually. Then every decision became easier than the one before. I stopped asking whether it was right. I listened without interrupting. He was not asking me to erase what had happened. He was simply facing it for the first time. Your father always told me that small compromises become large ones if we stop paying attention, I said softly. I wish I had remembered that sooner. His voice broke slightly. I disappointed him. No, I answered with more kindness than I expected to find inside myself. You disappointed yourself. That is the heavier burden. We ended the conversation without anger and without resolution. Some wounds require more than a single apology. Afterward, Daniel called briefly to let me know that the legal process was moving exactly as expected. Everything is proceeding peacefully, he said. That is what Robert hoped for. I thanked him and stepped onto Susan's back porch. The evening air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass, and somewhere nearby a wind chime echoed softly through the gathering dusk. For the first time in many days, I realized my heart was no longer racing. Justice had not arrived with shouting, humiliation, or revenge. It had arrived quietly through truth, patience, and the natural consequences of choices that could no longer be hidden. As I stood there watching the last light disappear beyond the trees, I understood that the hardest part of this journey was no longer protecting my home. It was learning how to carry my heart into whatever came next. 2 weeks later, I unlocked my front door with the same brass key I had carried for years. It turned smoothly, followed by the familiar sound Robert always said was the happiest sound a homeowner could hear. The house greeted me with quiet stillness. The walls had not forgotten us. Sunlight poured through the front windows, warming the hardwood floors where Ethan had once played with toy trucks, while Robert pretended to lose every race. Some furniture had been moved. A few things were missing. Others had been carefully returned during the legal process. None of that mattered as much as I once thought it would. A house can be repaired. Trust requires much more patience. The first thing I did was walk to the small table beside the staircase. Robert's leather Bible was still there, exactly where I had seen it through the glass that Sunday afternoon. I picked it up gently and held it against my chest without opening it. You knew me better than I knew myself, I whispered. Thank you for protecting me when you knew I would never think to protect myself. Outside, the maple tree we planted after Ethan graduated from high school swayed quietly in the Tennessee breeze. I opened every window in the house that afternoon, letting fresh air carry away days that had felt unbearably heavy. Susan arrived with sandwiches and lemonade. Together we laughed as we dusted shelves and returned family photographs to their places. This feels like your home again, she said, while straightening one of Robert's favorite framed pictures. I smiled. It feels like peace. A few days later, Ethan asked if we could meet at the small park near the courthouse, where he used to feed ducks as a little boy. I agreed because forgiveness begins with listening, not because consequences disappear. He arrived alone. He looked older than he had only a few weeks earlier. We sat on the same wooden bench without speaking for several minutes. Finally, he looked toward the pond instead of at me. I cannot undo what I did, he said quietly. No, I answered. None of us can change yesterday. Tears filled his eyes. Vanessa moved in with her sister for a while. We both realized that every decision we made depended on convincing ourselves that you would simply accept it. We stopped asking whether we were being fair. I nodded slowly. Sometimes the most dangerous lie is the one we tell ourselves often enough to believe. He looked at me then. Do you think we can ever be a family again? I took a long breath before answering. Families are not rebuilt by words. They are rebuilt one honest choice at a time. If you are willing to make those choices, then there is hope. He reached across the bench and gently held my hand the way he had done as a frightened little boy many years ago. Neither of us cried loudly. We simply sat together while a gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead. Healing, I learned, rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, one small moment after another. Over the following months, life settled into a new rhythm. I returned to church each Sunday, not carrying bitterness but gratitude. I joined my gardening club again. I invited Susan for coffee every Thursday afternoon. Ethan visited from time to time, always calling before he came, always knocking before entering. That simple act of knocking meant more to me than he could have imagined. It told me he finally understood that love without respect is incomplete. As for Vanessa, she sent me a handwritten letter several months later. She did not ask for anything. She simply apologized for allowing ambition and pride to become more important than compassion. I answered with a short note wishing her peace. Forgiveness does not always mean returning to the way things were. Sometimes it simply means refusing to carry hatred into tomorrow. Looking back now, I realize that the greatest gift Robert left me was never a legal document or a protected home. It was the reminder that dignity is something we must never surrender, even to the people we love most. Healthy boundaries do not destroy families. They give relationships the chance to become honest again. If you have ever been made to feel small inside your own home, I hope you remember this. Your kindness is a strength, but it should never become permission for others to erase your worth. Protect your peace. Respect yourself enough to set healthy boundaries. Independence is not loneliness. It is the quiet confidence that your value does not depend on someone else's approval. And when you choose truth over resentment, you give yourself the greatest chance to heal. If this story touched your heart, I would truly appreciate it if you would like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who may need these words today. The lesson I carry with me is simple. Love should always walk beside respect, never in front of it. Thank you for spending this time with me and allowing me to share one of the hardest chapters of my life. Wherever you are, I hope peace finds its way to your home, your heart, and your future. Until we meet again in another story, take good care of yourself and the people who choose to care for you.